So, welcome back to the second of these Bampton lectures. I'd like to start by going back to something I mentioned in the first lecture, if this is working for me. Yes, no? There we go. The sinking of the SS Dorchester in 1943. Now, this is a story that I've spoken about in lectures in different settings, maybe a dozen times. I think it's quite an illuminating episode. But I have to confess that every time I speak about it, it happened again today, I struggle to get through the narrative without my voice cracking. I have to talk firmly to myself and tell myself not to be so sentimental. But there is no getting away from it. For me at least, and I don't think I'm alone in this, this story, and others like it, have a visceral emotional pull. And if I take that story apart, it seems to me that every element of it is important. If 4 chaplains had shown similar self-sacrificial courage during a peacetime maritime accident, that would be a tragic and heroic tale. But it's the context of war, and not just war, that war, that gives it its force. If the contingent of chaplains on the Dorchester that night had been different, instead of that rather unusual mix of 2 Protestants, 1 Catholic, 1 Jew, a mix which showcases the Judeo-Christian United Front while also reassuringly preserving Protestantism as normative, then even if they'd shown the same courage, I don't think it would move me in quite the same way. And it's not just the Dorchester. I find the emotional pull of a certain kind of Second World War narrative to be embarrassingly inescapable, and I don't think I'm alone in this. Neville Chamberlain's radio broadcast of the 3rd of September 1939 announcing the declaration of war was made more than 30 years before I was born, and rhetorically it is nothing special, stiff, understated. But I doubt if there is any one snatch of audio recording that I have ever heard more often. No film or radio drama or documentary seems to be able to resist it. And it still chills my spine every time I hear it. And as to the Churchill speeches, those phrases have wormed their way into our collective consciousness in this country like Holy Writ. You may have seen Christopher Nolan's 2017 film Dunkirk, another one which I admit I struggle to get through dry-eyed. There's a splendid cinematic coup at the very end, in which the dazed and exhausted soldiers find themselves back in the relative temporary safety of Kent. They collapse onto a train, and one of them gets hold of a newspaper, which has a report of Churchill's "We shall go on to the end" speech of the 4th of June. And the soldier reads key sections of the speech aloud to his comrade. And he reads them without flourishes, stumbling, halting, very much as an exhausted and not especially educated man might read aloud a text that he's meeting for the first time. The entire scene depends on the fact that we, the audience, know the speech already. We can hear Churchill's cadences. It's the very hesitancy and clumsiness of the reading that helps us to hear the familiar words afresh. Now, normally the only words that need to be rescued from themselves like that are the words of Scripture. Now, I don't want to make too much of my own susceptibility to this kind of emotional manipulation, though given that I generally try to cultivate the callous cynicism normally expected of an academic, my abject failure in this regard is maybe noteworthy. More so is that no other narrative affects me, I find, in quite the same way. In particular, I notice that I am a professed and believing Christian. But the tragic and noble narrative of heroic self-sacrifice at the heart of my own supposed faith, the Passion of Christ, does not have the same visceral effect on me. I'm well aware that throughout the Christian centuries it often has had that effect, that a great many Christians have found themselves moved to tears, utterly emotionally shattered by the Passion narratives or by poetic or painted or acted versions of them. And I don't say that I'm unmoved but it usually takes some conscious devotional effort to get that way, and it can feel distant, an echo. The conclusion that I draw from this rather self-indulgent bout of introspection is that I was born in Britain in the second half of the 20th century. And as such, I may, indeed I do, believe in the Christian gospel, but not with the same intuitive immediacy and blithe faith with which I accept, without question, my culture's true religion, and that is the Second World War. In February 1943, an amateur theologian from Oxford travelled to my own Durham University to deliver a trio of lectures, soon published under the title The Abolition of Man. This is C.S. Lewis in rather unusual mode, prophet of doom, when his more usual style was more uplifting, and also deliberately and self-consciously cross-cultural, explicitly denying that he's working as a Christian apologist. And his theme in these lectures is the necessity of recognizing the objective reality of morality, of a broad but, in its essentials, universal code, which he sees not merely as binding on all humanity, but as constitutive of humanity, so that if, as he feared, we succeeded in liberating ourselves from it, or rather, if some few humans forcibly liberated the rest, including their own descendants, then the animals that would be left at the end of this process would have irrevocably lost what made them human. And this has become one of his most enduringly successful works, partly because everybody loves Doomsayer, but also because his not entirely convincing claim to be advancing a general philosophical rather than specifically Christian case has found some ready hearers. By early 1943, when he delivered these lectures, the war really was global, and Lewis is vividly aware of the war in Asia. Indeed, he begins these lectures with a withering takedown of a school textbook written by two hapless Australians, whom he uses as exemplars of spineless moral vacuity. And in his private correspondence, Lewis admitted that he had chosen them because he shared the widespread view in Britain that the fall of Singapore the year earlier was the fault of Australian cowardice. That awareness of the Asian struggle is part of the context for his decision to assert not Christian, not even Judeo-Christian values, but universal human values. And his rather playful decision to misuse a Chinese term, the Tao, to represent that universality. And this is a bold, genuinely inclusive, and also genuinely combative vision. It's properly Rooseveltian in its scope, scooping up all of the world's great civilizations into one grand alliance to confront amoral dehumanization in all its forms. And this is a phenomenon which he warned that Democrats and, of course, communists were susceptible to, as well as fascists. Put yourself in his shoes in 1943, you can see what he meant. The diagnosis of both fascism and Soviet communism as essentially anti-human, that's too obviously correct to comment on, although even in 1943, not everybody could see that. But he had also put his finger on the weakest feature of the secularism and scientism of the democratic centre-left of the interwar period. The ethics that political movement taught were frankly underdeveloped. An ill-formed assembly of benign, quasi-pacifist assumptions whose foundation, if it had one, was a kind of social Darwinism that favoured abstractions like progress and had a weakness for eugenics. Lewis goes on to sketch out a nightmare vision of where that kind of progress might lead in his 1945 novel, That Hideous Strength, which is the longest, the weakest, and the preachiest of his fiction works. And given those battle lines, hard to disagree with him. But instead, something that he didn't anticipate happened. By 1945, his critique of the ethically vacuous democratic socialism that he saw around him was already out of date. Because as it turned out, his argument was stronger than he thought it would be. the Western world's encounter with Nazism and its atrocities had, even before the scale of those atrocities was fully known, triggered what we can only call an ethical reawakening. The brilliance of Roosevelt's concept of Judeo-Christian civilization, the concept that Lewis was expanding on, was that it allowed a certain set of ethics, the four freedoms of the Atlantic Charter: freedom of speech and religion, freedom from want and fear. It allowed them to be expressed as universals. And it's that concept which drives the extraordinary decision to deal with German culpability for the Second World War in a completely different way from that chosen in the first. Notoriously, the Treaty of Versailles in 1919 had included a war guilt clause, claiming that Germany as a whole, the German people, were guilty of starting the First World War, a claim which was in any case arguable and certainly entirely unhelpful. But second time around, the Western Allies chose instead to settle the guilt for the war and its conduct on individuals, and to do so not by treaty or by some other form of fiat declaration, but by judicial or sort of judicial process. The Nuremberg trials were obviously victor's justice, and the defendants denied the legitimacy of the tribunal. But the evidence that was presented was real and was pretty much irrefutable. This was the ground on which the victors chose to take their stand in ethical terms, and it turned out to be solid indeed. C.S. Lewis's Tao, his universal human values, turned out to be harder to suppress than he feared they might be. The secular, progressive Western world, which he thought was going to be engulfed by an anti-humanist scientism, instead rushed to embrace and define itself by a new concept: human rights. In the age of Hitler, the post-Second World War age in which we now live, that idea is our shared faith. The concept of human rights is very deliberately formulated by legal philosophers to counteract an alternative idea which is popular in the wake of the First World War, the idea which is implied by the War Guilt Clause and by a number of other parts of the Paris Peace Treaties, which is the idea of group rights, the idea that underpins principles like national self-determination and ultimately underpins the rise of militaristic and exclusive nationalism. It's explicitly in response to Nazism that we have the creation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 and the European Convention on Human Rights in 1950, both of them in turn based on the Atlantic Charter of 1941. But of course the notion of human rights goes back much further than that. The American Constitution had a so-called Bill of Rights attached to it, a title that was lifted from an English document that was a century older. Now, those were legal rights asserted, at least initially, against specific authorities. But the French Revolution of 1789 produced a declaration of the rights of man and the citizen. And that too was informed by an earlier text, the work of the Francophile philosopher and slaveholder Thomas Jefferson, who in the American Declaration of Independence in 1776 famously wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights." Now, you'll notice, of course, that Jefferson doesn't mount an argument for the existence of these rights, nor does he try to enumerate them. He comments on, lists a few, and he insists that they are self-evident, they are just obvious, which, not coincidentally, is exactly how clergymen for many generations had claimed that we know there is a God. Subsequent declarations of rights have done exactly the same thing. The French Declaration simply asserts that the rights it describes are the natural, unalienable, and sacred rights of man. How do we know that human beings have rights? We just know. So this is obviously problematic. On one level, Jefferson's claim is just untrue. The existence of human rights is not self-evident. That is to say, a great many people in a great many historical settings have not perceived any such truth. The people whom he kept as slaves might have had something to say about it as well. But, this is a banal point. I think we all know that the modern doctrine of human rights is a castle in the air. It's a defiant existential assertion of values which we choose to claim without having any really solid philosophical foundation for it. If we're philosophers, that might bother us. But, and this is what I think is important, most of us, most of the time, are not bothered about this at all. Because on a deeper level, for us at least, Jefferson is right. We, in the post-45 era, really do find the existence of human rights and human equality self-evident. The intellectual basis for this doctrine may be weak, but it feels true. It's intuitively true. It is our form of what Lewis called the taboo. Indeed, the appendix to Lewis's Abolition of Man has this extraordinary cross-cultural list of examples of what he calls the taboo. He cites Christian and Jewish and Chinese and ancient Greek and Egyptian and Norse and Native American and other cultural examples to show agreement across the piece on values like benevolence, justice, and protection of the weak. Clauses from the UN Declaration of Human Rights could slot very comfortably into his list, the new faith of our secular age. If we try to articulate why we believe such things, the effort feels uncomfortable. It feels like we're questioning something that ought not to be questioned, almost committing a kind of blasphemy. Really, why do we believe in human rights? But the fact that we do believe them, down to our core, is not an answer. It is the problem. The closest we can come to an answer, I think, is the one advanced by the UN Declaration itself in 1948, which begins by asserting that human rights are the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world, a rather more pragmatic claim than Jefferson or the French had made. And it then goes on to explain that disregard and contempt for human rights have resulted in barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of mankind, and the advent of a world in which human beings shall enjoy freedom of speech and belief, and freedom from want and fear has been proclaimed as the highest aspiration of the common people. So, this is about the Second World War. I mean, of course it is. It's 1948. What do you expect? It's the experience of exceptionally barbarous acts, and the claim that the common people have united around the four rights proclaimed in the Atlantic Charter. That's what underpins the entire structure. The assumption that the common people can be identified with the victorious allies is reflected in the way that the United Nations slips from being a term for a military alliance to the term for a universal post-war organization. I suggest that our modern faith in human rights depends almost wholly on the memory of the Second World War and on the understanding of what evil is that came out of it. Now, I mentioned in the last lecture that I was holding in reserve a second character who recognized early on the moral earthquake that the Second World War represented. You may have thought I meant C.S. Lewis, but fond as I am of him, he's too conservative a curmudgeon to truly see the magnitude of what had happened. I was instead thinking of, as a couple of my friends here who I was speaking to guessed, of a German Jew born in the same year as Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Hannah Arendt. She escaped the Nazis by the skin of her teeth, reached New York in 1941, and as she meditated on her turbulent experience of the previous decade and worked on the preservation and recovery of Jewish culture in Germany during and after the war, she began to develop her understanding of the scale of what was taking place. And at the center of it was a phrase of Immanuel Kant's, das Radical Böse, radical evil, a phrase which Bonhoeffer had also applied to Nazism. And indeed, while C.S. Lewis doesn't use that phrase, it rhymes perfectly with his fear of dehumanization. Because what Kant meant by that, as I understand it, was that a person can be sufficiently overcome by the evil inherent within them that it overwhelms and even reverses their humanity. Arendt is one of the first thinkers truly to look Nazism unblinkingly in the face and ask what it meant that human beings could do such things. And Kant's concept is the least inadequate means that she found of explaining it. But she, like everybody else, took time to digest this new world And you'll be familiar enough with the chronology that I'm sketching out by now to expect that the crux came not in the immediate aftermath of the war, but in the early 60s. And in fact, if we want to select a single event as the moral pivot of this era, I would point not to the emergence of the contraceptive pill, but to the Eichmann trial. The kidnapping, and as we would now say, the extraordinary rendition of Adolf Eichmann, the most senior surviving architect of the Holocaust, from Argentina to Israel in May 1960, is a thunderbolt of an event. The painstaking trial from April to August 61 pulled the Nazi genocide, which much of the world had been trying to forget, back into the open. And Hannah Arendt spotted the opportunity to test her ideas about the nature of radical evil against the perfect subject. She persuaded the New Yorker to send her to Jerusalem for 6 weeks to cover the trial, and eventually her observations in the book Eichmann in Jerusalem were published the year after his execution. Now, it may well be, as has often been suggested, that her impression of Eichmann as a colourless bureaucrat, an empty vessel who merely wanted something to obey and carried out a genocide by default, that in this she was mistaken, that she was deceived by the persona that he created to try to navigate his trial. But whether or not he truly was as banal as she claimed, her notion of the banality of evil, of its grey inhumanity, its teetering on the edge of nothingness, that resonated not just with her earlier understanding of how radical evil eradicates humanity even from itself, but also more widely with the times. Because in the early 1960s, the Western world is starting to wake up to the memory of what had happened. Quite likely that large part of the timing of this change is just generational. Young people who had no personal memory of or implication in the war were coming of age, not least in Germany itself. A crux moment often forgotten in this country is the Spiegel affair of 1962-3, in which bold reporting by the West German weekly Der Spiegel about the state of the West German defense forces led to a failed attempt by the Christian Democrat defense minister to charge the journalists with treason. And this was accompanied by a wave of public demonstrations. It's often taken to be the point at which the West German state becomes a genuine democracy. On its face, this scandal isn't about the Nazi past, but of course, it's about nothing else. The underpinning question was this to be a state whose people served it, or a state constituted of and existing to serve its people? Was it collectivist or individualist? Was it governed by power or by law? Was it a society governed by the interest of nations or by this intoxicating new notion of human rights? We can use the cinema as a guide. The retellings of the Second World War in the 50s were generally of a national struggle against an enemy of the traditional kind. I mean, that could be somber and bitter, as in The Cruel Sea in 1953, or rousingly patriotic, as in The Dam Busters in 1955. Both films remarkable for being Second World War films with virtually no actual Germans in them, which is, of course, a faithful reflection of most British airmen's and mariners' wartime experience. But it also reflected the new political reality that West Germany is a vital Cold War ally, and that burying past differences was a matter of some urgency. The plot of another British war film of the 50s, the rip-roaring desert adventure Ice Cold in Alec from 1958, turns around the character of a German spy who falls in with the crew of a British ambulance making its way across the Egyptian desert. They only realise his identity after he's shared their struggles and has actually saved their lives. And they end up lying to British military police so that he can be held as an honourable prisoner of war rather than shot as a spy. This kind of thing reaches a sort of crescendo in that's the famous beer in Alexandria. Reaches a kind of crescendo in the 1962 D-Day film The Longest Day, in which the impression of the German army as honourable opponents is underpinned by the involvement of several former German generals, large numbers of German actors, and the West German government itself in the production. There's been a lot of subsequent criticism of this and many other cinematic and artistic portraits of so-called good Germans, of soldiers who were merely doing their patriotic duty, as Eichmann and the Nuremberg defendants before him had claimed. I'm inclined to be a little more forgiving of this kind of thing. So there's a Cold War rationale for it. Even so, after a desperate and bloody war, to so quickly move to humanize the enemy, to recognize individuals and to differentiate amongst them, it's a moral achievement of sorts. But already in the early 60s, this is shifting. A bizarre example of this comes in Britain's epic answer to The Longest Day, the much-loved 1963 film The Great Escape, which portrays the German armed forces as two almost completely different, indeed antagonistic, entities. The regular armed forces are represented by the Luftwaffe Colonel von Luger, the commandant of the camp, who is an honourable gentleman almost to a fault, and is portrayed as openly opposed to the Gestapo and the SS, who alone are made to bear responsibility for the atrocities. What's relatively new, though, is giving villainous Germans and their actions screen time at all. And, of course, that is something that's only going to accelerate over the following decades. I'll resist the temptation to go through the whole history of the Second World War on film with you. But I will say this much. First of all, on film, and indeed in every other medium, this is the story that our culture cannot leave alone. The French novelist Laurent Binet calls the Second World War our Trojan War. A landmark, he says, a reference, a source of inexhaustible stories, a collection of epics and tragedies. And to see his point, you only need to compare the richness and moral force and complexity of these many stories to the grim monotone in which our few narratives of the First World War are told. And secondly, as we keep returning to these stories, the way we tell them has shifted. Atrocities, the cruelty of occupation, anti-Semitism, racism, genocide. These things have become the center of the story. If you made a romp like Ice Cold in Alec's now, allowing the Holocaust to slip by, you would be suspected of Holocaust denial, and probably correctly. Nor is it limited simply to the way that we remember the Second World War. What really shows the depth and breadth of the moral lessons that are starting to be drawn from the conflict is the way it begins to be transposed into other forms. Narratives that don't really have anything to do with the Second World War find themselves bringing in Nazis because they're the best villains. Our modern creed can be summed up by that great philosopher Indiana Jones. Nazis. I hate these guys. You might think, for example, that the appearance of the Illinois Nazi Party in the 1980 film The Blues Brothers is gratuitous. And of course it is. But it's not an accident, because what possible better counterpoint could there be to that film's message of anarchic racial inclusivity? The more respectable term for this kind of thing is Godwin's law. The principle that every argument on the internet eventually ends when someone calls someone else a Nazi. Now, that law exists for a reason, because to call someone a Nazi in our culture is quite literally the ultimate, the final insult. The reason it ends an argument is that it's a punch in the face. It puts an end to any further discussion. What can you say in reply to that, other than maybe to hurl the same charge back at your opponent? It is our final reference point. A century ago, the most potent figure in Western society was Jesus. Now it's Adolf Hitler. Maybe we still believe that Jesus is good, but not with the same fervour and conviction that we believe Nazism is evil. Crosses and crucifixes have lost most of their power in our culture. You can play with them, you can even joke about them, nobody really minds, but there is no visual image which now packs as visceral an emotional punch as a swastika. The contrarians, the trolls, the shock merchants of our day and age generally understand that this is a line they do not cross. Ken Livingstone, the former mayor of London, had a long career as a gleefully rule-breaking politician spanning 3 decades. He may have imagined there was nothing he could say that would place him beyond the pale. But it turns out there was one thing. When he said in 2016 on his radio show in the course of criticizing the state of Israel that Hitler was supporting Zionism before he went mad and ended up killing 6 million Jews, and then refused to back down from that rather singular interpretation of the period, he wasn't only expelled from Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party for anti-Semitism, which is an achievement in itself, you might think, but brought his career to a sudden, shuddering end. Now, it may be, as I'm going to suggest in next week's lectures, that the taboo on which he broke himself is no longer holding as firmly as we might once have imagined, but for the time being it still holds. To put it another way, if you defend Stalin, or peddle conspiracy theories about 9/11, you will be seen as deluded. But if you deny the Holocaust, you are intolerable. And when you are ostracized, no one is going to defend you with talk about cancel culture. And rightly so, because we know that in our cultural context, such a claim is never a naive historical mistake. It is always a deliberate attempt to justify the unjustifiable. Holocaust denial is our modern equivalent of blasphemy. Words that deny the deepest moral truth our society is built on and that we know are never spoken in innocence. Let me try a thought experiment with you. Imagine that you hear of some new research being done by historians from an impeccably respectable institution into the Nazi genocide. And what you hear is that these historians have concluded, after careful analysis of the surviving sources, that the number of Jews murdered in the death camps has been slightly overstated and ought to be revised down. Not by much. The error that they claim to have detected is only a couple of percentage points, so maybe not even as much as 100,000 human lives. Now, re-examining sources and refining claims like that is the kind of thing that historians do. It's what we're for. And there does, in fact, continue to be a real range of uncertainty about the actual numbers. But how do you feel when you hear this hypothetical claim? And now imagine the alternative, that you read a similar report of work done by similar researchers, only this time they want to revise the death toll up slightly. How do you feel about that claim? Well, I'm giving the lecture here, so I have to guess at what your feelings are. But I'm fairly confident in doing so. I'm going to guess that the first set of researchers make you uncomfortable. You immediately suspect their honesty, or at least their professionalism. And with good reason, because you are well aware that there are actual Nazi apologists out there who consistently seize on or distort any ambiguous or incomplete or complex evidence they can find in order to minimize or to deny Nazism's crimes. And if you manage to convince yourselves that this modest downward revision of the death toll was in fact plausible, I'm going to guess you would still find it disturbing. You would be well aware of how this interpretation would be seized on by Nazi apologists. You might even ask whether the historians were wise to publish their findings, knowing how they'd be twisted and misused. The idea that that iconic number, which even Ken Livingstone cited, 6 million, which incidentally was Eichmann's best guess, the idea that that might have to start being qualified with a probably or an almost, that would be unsettling. It would take a little bit of the force out of one of the central events around which our moral universe is built. Whereas those other historians, the ones who want to revise the death toll up, now they sound sober, judicious, level-headed scholars making their way through horrors. We'd be ready to believe them. Grateful, even, because they underline, they reinforce what we think about the world. Certainly those are the gut reactions I would have. In other words, we would hear a report of 100,000 innocent deaths as good news. and feel a report that the same number of people had not been killed with sinking unease. I suggest this means that we do not generally remember the Holocaust because we want to remember and honour its victims. What we want to remember are its villains. When we say we will never forget, what most of us mean is that we will never forget what they did and what other people in their place, what we in their place, could all too easily do again. The numbers of the dead are simply the evidence. It's a story about evil and about evildoers, not about the human lives that were destroyed. I vividly remember visiting the Jewish Museum in Berlin and being surprised in exactly the way that the museum sets out to surprise you. I had expected to find a museum centered around the Holocaust. I think I had even hoped to find such a museum that would tell me once again the old story around which I've built so many of my values, give me again those comforting certainties, that reassurance that I have my moral bearings and I know what evil looks like. Instead, I found a museum about the lives of German Jews, not about their deaths, about their long and particular and complicated history, in which the failed attempt to exterminate them is only one episode, a uniquely catastrophic one to be sure, but one by which they should not and will not be defined. I recognised that this was a better, a truer, a more alive museum than the one that I had imagined I was going to find, and I hardly dared admit to myself that I was disappointed. The distinctive feature of living in the age of Hitler, as I would argue we do, is that we don't really want to be told new things about that story. We want to be told the old things over and over, or at least new things that fit seamlessly in with what we already know. That's how we know we're dealing not with the memory of a historical event, but with something more like a faith. I think, in fact, the clearest sign that this mythical understanding of, mythical not in the sense that it didn't happen, but that it's been given that sort of significance of Nazism, is the way that it continues to be transposed into entirely fictional settings, which lets it be reshaped and purified in the process. And this started while the war was still going on. To many people it is incongruous, even embarrassing, that the 20th century's best-selling work of fiction is an excessively long, unapologetically archaic, and sometimes rather self-indulgent fairy tale, written by a philologist who's a very traditional Catholic and whose most devoted readers were and remain teenage boys. But even if you share the disdain for Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, I don't think there's any gainsaying its cultural importance. Tolkien himself had no patience for allegory as a literary form. He vigorously denied that he'd written one. But if his War of the Ring doesn't mirror the Second World War, which was raging as he wrote the book, it certainly refracts it. And he privately admitted this as much. Tolkien is an early and a staunch opponent of Nazism, but he's also a veteran of the Battle of the Somme. And he knew that this war was, like any war, an ultimately evil job. So he told his son in 1944. And he used the language of his own developing myth to explain what he meant. Not only, as he said, that there are a great many orcs on our side, but that we are attempting to conquer Sauron with the ring. Such a war might end in victory, but a victory whose effect would be to breed new Saurons. And so what he wrote wasn't an allegory of the real war, but a counterpoint to it. The war as it should have been. The war between a villain who seeks to impose a dehumanizing tyranny and heroes who, despite strenuous temptations and at great risk, decide to destroy the power to impose tyranny rather than to turn it to their own purposes. Now, for all the vividness of Tolkien's depiction of combat itself, I mean, this is fantastically implausible even in its own terms. But we're not talking about realistic fiction here, we're talking about myth. If we're going to use the memory of the Second World War to reset our moral compasses, then mythical Clear-cut versions of it are what's needed. And as Tolkien warned, although not quite in the way that he meant, we have indeed been breeding new Saurons ever since. The figure of the Dark Lord has stalked through the most persistent and popular mythologies of the post-war era. In Star Wars, he destroys entire planets, he has stormtroopers, jackbooted interrogators, and is ultimately defeated by plucky farmers. In Harry Potter, 2 decades later, the racial element is much more to the fore. The villain openly pursues a racialized supremacy, gives his followers a name, the Death Eaters, and a set of symbols which openly mimic the SS. And indeed, by the end of those books and in the most recent series of films, the struggle against those villains is being directly overlaid onto the Second World War narrative itself. But the same vision is already there in one of the most compelling and enduring television creations of the early 1960s, the Daleks, Nazis on wheels. In the very first Dalek story in 1963, when our heroes hear their plan to wipe out the entire race of their enemies, they call it murder, but the Dalek they're speaking to corrects them. Not murder, it says, but extermination. A clinical term worthy of any Nazi. And these creatures are Arendt's dehumanization made into flesh and metal. And it's a vital part of the myth that they're not robots, but vessels into which a warped, corrupted, intrinsically feeble remnant of a living thing has placed itself. This is an evil which is both radical and banal. Now, the debt that these ersatz Hitlers, and there are many others, owe to their real-world archetype is sometimes implied, it's sometimes openly acknowledged, but I think it's always plain. These are the myths on which generations of children in the post-Christian West have been raised, transposing, cleansing the brutal lessons of the Second World War into timeless morality tales. These are the lessons that our culture is determined to teach itself and eager repeatedly to relearn. That this is what evil looks like, even though in reality evil rarely appears in such unambiguous dress. So if we ask why it is that Christianity went into decisive retreat in the West in the early 60s and from then on, and the long process of secularization enters a new phase, I think there is almost a simple answer to that question. Because the one key and uncontested function that Christianity had been serving in Western societies up to that point was suddenly redundant. Whatever else Christianity had been, it was a store of value. It was the form of the Tao that had a grip on Western culture's collective imagination, so that believers and unbelievers alike accepted the authority of Jesus' ethics as reflexively as we now accept the notion of human rights. But once a new set of values was in place, once a powerful new lodestone had corrected our moral compasses or reset them so that what once pointed towards Jesus now pointed away from Hitler, that subtle adjustment to our moral directions made the old maps redundant. I mentioned in the first lecture Callum Brown's argument about the nature of British secularization in which gender plays a central role. And indeed, given that the idea of women's rights is absolutely linked to the idea of human rights and that both of them represent an utter antithesis of Nazism, and also that women's rights in the modern sense are in some tension with traditional Christian ethics, given all that, I do not disagree with him. But what I actually want to cite is another work by Brown, his remarkable 2017 book, Becoming Atheist. This is an oral history of modern unbelief, based on interviews with 85 adult atheists across Europe and North America. Brown's atheists have very varied stories, but when he comes to their ethics and values, he finds an astonishing degree of consistency around a certain ethical code. Two key elements to this code. First is the so-called golden rule of treating others as you would like to be treated, which is a Christian imperative, but as Brown quite rightly points out, not an exclusively Christian one. And then a linked set of principles about human equality and bodily and sexual autonomy. And Brown calls this ethical framework humanism, a word which not many of his interviewees volunteered, but which he says all of them were happy to accept when he put it to them. We might call it the doctrine of human rights. And what makes it interesting, one of the things that makes it interesting, is that these people don't describe a conscious process of being converted to or trained in this doctrine. It wasn't a manifesto they'd embraced or a program that was imposed on them. Those of them who had grown up in religious settings recalled that they had embraced this ethic before they broke with their religion. And when the breaking point did come, it was either because of a conflict between their religious and humanist ethics, which are similar but not identical, or because their humanist ethics now made their religion appear redundant. The implication is that in the West since the mid-20th century, growing numbers of earnestly or nominally religious people have adopted an ethic which is independent of their religion and in some tension with it, and so have either drifted away from or consciously rejected that religion. Now, Brown, who is a card-carrying humanist himself, claims rather charmingly that this convergence around a shared set of values suggests that these values are indeed a form of what Lewis would call the Tao, a set of human universals on which all people will settle if they are spared the distorting effects of religion or other ideology. He suggests that these values arise from within human experience, and indeed that reason alone may construct humanism. This is rather like the way theologians, until recently, might argue for the existence of God from universal human consensus. Obviously, it's wrong. Modern humanism is in no sense an expression of universal human values. Its ethical markers, such as gender and racial equality or sexual freedom or a strong doctrine of individual human rights and a sharp distinction between the human and the non-human realms. In a long historical perspective, these are very unusual beliefs indeed. The fact that those values appear intuitively obvious to Brown and his interviewees, and indeed to me, that is not the answer, that's the problem. The answer, rather, I suggest, is that those values are the sea in which we all swim. We live still in the age of Hitler, and our moral compasses are set. Some of us have overlaid religious values onto those fundamental secular values. Some of us may even tell ourselves that our religious values are the fundamental ones. And the fact that we have persuaded our religious values to agree with those secular ones is a happy coincidence. We're slow to recognize the depth of the moral consensus that defines our society, partly because of the ancient inability of fish to know what water is, and partly because one of the particular convictions that defines our self-image in Western societies is that we are hopelessly divided and fractured into irreconcilable pluralities. I want gently to suggest that this image is a little overstated. There are profoundly divided societies in the world today. There have been more so in the past, but ours are not, or not yet, among them. We do accept, happily or grudgingly or helplessly, the same broad envelope of political and economic and cultural institutions. We are capable of moving together with remarkable speed as a society when we need to. Witness the astonishing consensus that allowed our collective life to be utterly transformed in a matter of days, with virtually no social disorder at the start of the pandemic 2 years ago. Our disagreements, our alienations, bitter and profound as they are still contained within a shared bubble of values. The bubble that allows us still to shout at each other. Godwin's law still holds, providing us with a shared insult, a label that no one takes as a compliment, or not without exiling themselves from our social world. It's often said by social conservatives, often with an elegiac air, that in our pluralist society we no longer have a shared sacred narrative or a set of values to hold us together. The unspoken subtext is usually that we need to return to an older, likely a Christian set of values. But the truth is we do. We have the narrative of our standing against Nazism, the story of the Second World War, our Trojan War, our Paradise Lost, our sacred story, the one that we tell and retell and reimagine so as to keep immersing ourselves and our children in what evil truly is, in how our parents and now grandparents and great-grandparents fought to defeat it, and how we must do so again in our own time and in our own way. Those are our shared values, and in them we will be content to live and die. Or at least that's what we might have said until recently. That's the song that we might have sung defiantly to ourselves to keep up our faith. Because now in the 2020s it really does look as if this shared set of values is beginning to unravel, and our societies are heading for darker places. In next week's lectures, I'm going to explore what that might mean, and I will suggest that it may be a good thing, that it is indeed time that we left the age of Hitler behind us. Thank you very much.